Jonathan Roumie walked into the House Financial Services Committee hearing with a quiet reverence, wearing a simple navy suit and carrying a stack of carefully marked notes. He wasn't a politician, nor did he pretend to be. He was an invited public advocate, there to speak on behalf of underserved communities. But across the room sat Representative Matt Gaetz, grinning with the self-assurance of someone who believed the moment belonged to him. Gaetz, the Florida Republican known for his biting sound bites and camera-ready jabs, had built a brand on ridiculing anyone he deemed too soft, too emotional, or too unqualified. He viewed Roumie, a devout actor best known for portraying Christ in The Chosen, as the perfect target, an outsider, a moralist, an easy foil. So when Gaetz leaned into his mic and mocked Roumie as just another actor preaching feelings instead of facts, the room tensed. What happened next, however, would flip the narrative and leave the entire chamber stunned. This wasn't just a clash of egos. This was the moment where arrogance met discipline, where cynicism collided with conviction, and where one well-timed response unraveled an entire persona built on bluster. Within hours, the clip went viral. But to truly understand what made this confrontation so explosive, you have to understand what led up to it. Before we break down how Jonathan Roumie dismantled Matt Gaetz in front of a live congressional audience, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because what you are about to witness is a rare moment in modern politics, where preparation, character, and calm resolve rise above performance and provocation. The hearing was originally about banking regulations, but it quickly became something much bigger. The day Matt Gaetz learned never to underestimate Jonathan Roumie. Jonathan Roumie is not a politician. At 49, the actor and faith-based advocate had spent most of his life using his voice to inspire, not to attack. Raised in New York City, he worked his way through odd jobs, studied the spiritual and psychological depths of humanity through performance, and eventually rose to prominence portraying one of the most revered figures in human history, Jesus of Nazareth. He didn't come to the Capitol with bluster. He came with spreadsheets, federal data, and testimony from grassroots organizations. But Roumie's path to that seat was anything but easy. As a faith-driven public figure in an increasingly hostile media environment, he'd been dismissed, mocked, and underestimated. His work in addiction recovery programs, his advocacy for inner-city mentorship, and his refusal to engage in the culture wars made him a target for both right-wing cynics and left-wing skeptics. But like any man of faith forged through hardship, he learned not to shout louder. He learned to listen deeper. That's what made him dangerous to people like Matt Gaetz. Because when Jonathan Roumie speaks, he doesn't perform. He reveals. He exposes what others hide behind sarcasm and spectacle. He had reviewed the legislation. He had memorized voting records. He had spent nights calling community leaders across the country. And when he stepped into that room, he wasn't just prepared, he was ready. Matt Gaetz, on the other hand, represented the exact political establishment Jonathan came to confront. A 42-year-old Republican firebrand from Florida, Gaetz had risen in Congress not through policy work, but through viral moments and media spectacle. With a slick suit and practiced grin, he presented himself as the intellectual bruiser of the right. Before politics, Gaetz had dabbled in law and built a reputation on cable news for being the guy who says what others won't. His donors loved it. His clips racked up millions of views. But beneath the persona was a troubling pattern. A man who mocked expertise, dismissed compassion, and wore his arrogance like armor. His political strategy was simple: attack first, research later, if at all. And so far, it had worked. In past hearings, he had rattled activists, academics, and even junior members of Congress. He knew how to twist the narrative, how to look into the camera and deliver a line like it was scripted by a PR firm. What he didn't know was how to handle someone who had actually done their homework. The stage was set for a confrontation. What Matt Gaetz didn't know was that Jonathan Roumie had spent the entire weekend preparing meticulously, prayerfully, strategically for this exact moment. He had read every line of Gaetz's voting record. He had highlighted every public statement, cataloged every media appearance, and combed through the congressman's financial disclosures with the attention of someone preparing not for a performance, but for a reckoning. This wasn't about ego. This was about truth, and Roumie came ready to defend it. This wasn't just two public figures disagreeing. It was a battle between preparation and pretense, reverence and ridicule. Roumie represented a new voice, calm, steady, rooted in principle and conscience. Gaetz represented a fading style, loud, performative, untouchable, or so he believed. Yes, the hearing was supposed to be about banking regulations, but that was just the setting. The real story unfolding in that room was deeper. Who gets to be taken seriously in American public life? Is it the one with the microphone or the one who did the work? Every member on that committee felt it. The air was tight with anticipation. Cameras were rolling, millions would watch, and most of them had no idea that they were about to witness a moment that would ripple far beyond Capitol Hill. Chairman Patrick McHenry gavelled the session to order. Witnesses were sworn in. The topic, a proposed set of lending regulations aimed at protecting underserved communities from discriminatory practices. Democrats argued for stronger oversight. Republicans claimed too much regulation would hinder economic growth. Standard ideological theater. But then came the questioning. Each member received 5 minutes. The order followed seniority. Matt Gaetz wasn't due to speak until later, but that didn't stop him. True to form, he began interrupting with procedural objections and points of order, clearly aiming to derail the flow and claim more screen time. When Jonathan Roumie was finally recognized to address the witnesses, he didn't start with rhetoric. He opened a binder. He referenced federal data. He held up lending maps that exposed redlining patterns across 5 states. He cited case law. He quoted community organizers. His voice was even, his delivery grounded. He wasn't speaking to impress. He was speaking to inform. And that's exactly when Gaetz made his first mistake. Interrupting Roumie mid-sentence, Gaetz leaned forward with his trademark smirk. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "I think we need to clarify something. The gentleman appears to be confusing correlation with causation. Perhaps, before we continue, he could benefit from a brief primer in basic economic principles." Silence. Interrupting another speaker during questioning time was bad enough, but it was the sneering tone, the implied superiority that made the entire room freeze. He hadn't just challenged Roumie's ideas. He'd mocked his intellect. He'd called him ignorant in front of the country. Chairman McHenry attempted to restore order, but it was too late. The moment was already burned into every camera. Jonathan Roumie didn't flinch. He simply closed his binder, folded his hands, and waited for Gaetz to finish. Then, with the serenity of someone who had already won, he said, "I'll yield the rest of my time, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to wait until my colleague from Florida finishes his lesson." The sarcasm was measured, gentle even, but razor sharp. On the Republican side, some chuckled smugly, thinking Gaetz had scored an easy point. On the Democratic side, staffers looked concerned. They knew what Roumie was up against, a showman with no limits. When Gaetz's official turn came 20 minutes later, he was emboldened, his grin wide, his posture confident. This was his arena. He adjusted his tie and stared into the camera, clearly addressing more than just the committee. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. "I'd like to circle back to the earlier comments from our guest, Mr. Roumie." He paused, letting the name hang as if it didn't belong in the room. "I think the American people deserve clarity on the difference between emotional appeals and sound economic policy." He was setting the trap. Gaetz then theatrically pulled out a folder. "Mr. Roumie has a very impressive resume. Hollywood actor, speaker, religious figure. I respect that. I do. But acting and preaching are not policymaking. This chamber is not a stage," he smiled. "Sometimes I think our guests confuse being passionate with being correct." The line was carefully constructed, a jab dressed in courtesy, a dig at Roumie's faith, his vocation, his very identity. The subtle disdain was not lost on the room. The way Gaetz said religious figure sent a wave of discomfort through several members. It was a rhetorical dog whistle, meant to discredit, not engage. Some Republican aides started tweeting immediately, "Gaetz puts actor in his place." Conservative staffers in the gallery whispered to one another. Gaetz was hitting his stride. He turned to the witness panel. "I'd like to ask our experts," he said, "whether policymaking should be based on heartfelt stories and cherry-picked stats, or on real data that serves everyone, not just the loudest voices." The witnesses, caught off guard, responded cautiously. They hadn't come to referee a political duel. But Gaetz wasn't finished. He could feel momentum. "Mr. Chairman," he declared, "I'll yield the rest of my time to make one final point." He leaned back, eyes locking on Roumie. "Sometimes the loudest voices in this room are the least informed. The American people deserve better than moralizing from those who haven't done their homework." He didn't know it yet, but that was the moment Matt Gaetz lost. Jonathan Roumie sat still. No anger, no reaction, just silence. The kind of silence that comes right before a storm. The The smirk on Matt Gaetz's face showed how pleased he was with his performance. "I hope," Gaetz concluded, "that in the future, all members of this committee will focus on facts instead of feelings when discussing these important issues." Republican members nodded in agreement. Conservative staffers in the gallery were already typing up tweets praising Gaetz for schooling the actor. The Florida congressman leaned back in his chair, visibly satisfied with what he thought was a masterful takedown. What he didn't notice was Jonathan Roumie's expression. He wasn't angry, he wasn't flustered, he was smiling. Chairman McHenry turned to move on, calling the next member in the queue. But Roumie calmly raised his hand and cited a procedural rule, requesting a response to a direct personal reference. "Mr. Chairman," he said with unwavering steadiness, "the gentleman from Florida has made some claims that I believe deserve clarification. I respectfully request the opportunity to respond, for the record." The room went still. McHenry glanced around, sensing the building tension. Denying the request would seem clearly unfair. He gave a short nod. "The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes." Jonathan Roumie rose slowly. He adjusted his mic with quiet precision. His face was composed, peaceful, but his eyes locked onto Gaetz and didn't move. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Roumie began, his voice calm and full of resonance, the kind that silences a room. "The gentleman from Florida has offered some thoughts on preparation and understanding the nature of banking. I appreciate his concern for whether I've done my homework." Gaetz's smirk returned momentarily. He clearly expected deflection, maybe even retreat, but Roumie gently reached under the desk and pulled out a thick folder. "So, let's talk about homework," he said, flipping open the cover. "Let's talk about facts." He lifted the first document. "These are the voting records from the Financial Services Committee for the last 2 years. The gentleman from Florida has missed 47% of the votes on banking regulation. That's nearly half. That's not an interpretation. That's documented." A low murmur rippled through the chamber. Missed votes of that magnitude were serious. "But maybe he was tied up with other matters," Roumie continued, still professional but firmer now. "Let's take a look." He lifted another page from the folder. "These are the appearance records and speaking fees reported by the gentleman's office. During those missed votes, he made 23 paid media appearances on conservative networks. Total compensation, $127,000. Now, even some Republican members looked visibly uncomfortable. Gaetz shifted in his seat. "But perhaps," Roumie added, "those appearances were policy-focused. So let's examine the substance." He reached for his reading glasses, an unassuming gesture that somehow made what came next land even harder. Fox Business, March 15th, quote, "Banking regulation is boring. Most Americans don't care about the technical details." Gasps, then silence. CNN on April 3rd, quote, "I don't need to study every banking rule to know Democrats want to overregulate everything." Roumie turned the page. "But my favorite," he said with quiet finality, "is from the podcast appearance last week, the one that sparked this exchange." He read it slowly. "Some of these Democrats spend so much time studying the details that they miss the big picture. Real leadership is about instinct, not paperwork." Roumie gently closed the folder and looked directly at Gaetz. "So let me get this straight," he said, pummeling. "The gentleman who has missed half the votes, who says he doesn't study the details, who finds banking regulation boring, wants to lecture me about doing my homework." The room fell completely silent, save for the soft clicks of cameras and a few breathless exhales. Roumie didn't stop. "Let me tell the gentleman from Florida what I did with my weekend." He reached for a second folder, even thicker. "I reviewed every major banking proposal from the last 5 years. I analyzed lending data from all 50 states. I studied the economic impact studies the gentleman has never cited." He paused again, then leaned in ever so slightly. "But more importantly," he said, his voice now steady with moral weight, "I studied the gentleman's own financial disclosures." At those words, Gaetz paled. The shift was visible. The gentleman owns stock in 3 major banks that would be directly affected by the regulations we're discussing today. Total value approximately $340,000, all purchased after he joined this committee. Now, the Republican side of the dais erupted into whispered chaos. Roumie stood still. "So when the gentleman speaks of economic analysis, perhaps he should disclose that his analysis is worth $340,000 to his personal portfolio." He lifted his gaze again, calm but cutting. "And about that earlier comment on correlation versus causation," he said, "let me explain it to the gentleman this way. When someone misses 47% of their votes, earns $127,000 doing TV hits, calls banking regulation boring, and owns 340,000 in related stock. That's not correlation with poor representation. That's causation. The Democratic side of the room erupted before Chairman McHenry could gavel them down. Applause, murmurs, audible awe. Roumie stood serene in the storm. "You want to talk about homework?" he said. "Here's my homework. 47 missed votes, 23 paid appearances, multiple public statements dismissing this issue, and a direct financial interest in the outcome of today's discussion." He turned again to Gaetz, who now stared down at his desk. "So yes," Roumie concluded, "the American people do deserve better than grandstanding from those who haven't done their homework. They deserve representatives who vote, who study, and who do not personally profit from the very policies they pretend to debate." He paused, then delivered the final blow, not with rage, but with stillness. "And they certainly deserve better than being talked down to by men who think sincerity is weakness and performance is wisdom." Silence. "I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman," Roumie said softly, returning to his seat as the camera zoomed in on a stunned and speechless Matt Gaetz. Jonathan Roumie paused for effect, letting the silence breathe. Then, with clarity cutting through the noise, he delivered the final blow. "And the American people absolutely deserve better than representatives who believe they can bury their own failures by attacking the preparation and intelligence of others." The room erupted. Democratic members applauded openly. Republican members were furiously texting their staffers. Chairman McHenry was pounding his gavel, trying to regain control, but the moment had already broken loose. "I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman," Roumie said softly, calmly, organizing his papers as if he had simply completed a routine task. Matt Gaetz, meanwhile, sat frozen. The confident smirk that had carried him into the hearing was gone, replaced by shock, by realization. He had walked in expecting an easy target and had instead been dismantled by a man he thought would never do the work. The hearing dragged on for another hour, but no one cared about lending laws anymore. Not the witnesses, not the members, not the press. Every reporter in the room was laser-focused on what had just unfolded. Every major camera had captured Roumie's composure and Gaetz's slow-motion collapse. Within minutes, clips of the exchange hit social media. Within an hour, it was everywhere. The hashtag #RoumieRipsGaetz was trending in the US TikTok edits, spread like wildfire. Twitter was ablaze with reactions. Commentators called it one of the most brutal congressional confrontations in recent memory. The first viral tweet came from a Democratic staffer. "This is what happens when preparation meets arrogance. Jonathan Roumie just gave a masterclass in truth under pressure." Attached was a 60-second video, Gaetz's smirk vanishing, frame by frame, as Roumie unveiled the damning facts: missed votes, speaking fees, and undisclosed financial ties. Even conservative Twitter couldn't spin it. One right-wing analyst tweeted, "This is why you don't wing it." Gaetz walked into a buzzsaw. CNN was first to run the full story. Anderson Cooper then aired the clip in prime time. "This wasn't a debate," Cooper said solemnly. "This was a dismantling." Roumie came armed with documents. Gaetz came armed with bravado. It was no contest. Political analysts echoed the sentiment. Gloria Borger remarked, "Roumie didn't just defend himself. He flipped the attack. Every page, every quote, surgical." Jake Tapper added, "Gaetz assumed his opponent hadn't done the homework. He didn't know Roumie had done everyone's homework." On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow dedicated an entire segment. "This was not spontaneous," she said, pointing to Roumie's folder system. "This was a man who expected disrespect and came prepared for war." With charts and graphics, she broke down each moment. 47 missed votes, 127,000 in media payments, 340,000 in bank stocks. Chris Hayes summarized it best. "When someone calls you unprepared and you calmly show that they're profiting off what they claim to regulate, that's not a comeback, that's political annihilation." Even Fox News couldn't shield Gaetz. Brett Baer called it a rough day for the congressman, adding, "If you're going to make it personal in Congress, you better be ready for the consequences." And in a rare moment of blunt honesty, Tucker Carlson simply said, "Sometimes you get what you deserve." Late-night shows pounced. Stephen Colbert played the clip of Gaetz's grin fading. That's the face of a man who just realized he brought a selfie stick to a courtroom. Trevor Noah chimed in. Gaetz thought he was roasting a preacher. Turns out that preacher was a walking audit. Within 48 hours, the political shockwaves were undeniable. Development number 1, ethics. Watchdogs launched inquiries into Gaetz's stock holdings and voting record. The Campaign Legal Center released a statement. Representative Gaetz's stock purchases while serving on the Financial Services Committee raised serious red flags regarding congressional ethics rules. Development number 2, banking reform groups seized the moment to demand tougher conflict of interest laws. A spokesperson from the Progressive Change Campaign Committee asked, "How can Congressman Gaetz regulate banks when he owns nearly $500,000 in their stocks?" Development number 3, Gaetz was quietly removed from his speaking slot at the upcoming CPAC conference. Organizers claimed scheduling conflicts, but insiders knew the truth. He went from asset to liability. And as for Jonathan Roumie, the confrontation catapulted him from admired faith-based figure to national symbol of moral clarity under pressure. His team received over 300 interview requests in 3 days. His social media following jumped by 200,000 plus. He was invited to appear on Meet the Press, The View, and 60 Minutes. More significantly, Democratic leadership took notice. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries personally called Jonathan Roumie to congratulate him. In a statement released later that day, Jeffries wrote, "Jonathan showed today why preparation, conviction, and humility will always defeat arrogance and assumption." Progressive fundraising groups immediately began featuring Roumie in national campaign emails, citing his devastating takedown of Matt Gaetz as the kind of moral courage needed in today's political arena. Within a week, Roumie's grassroots donation totals surged past $500,000, fueled by tens of thousands of small contributions from across the country. But the true shift came in how Washington began to treat him. Senior Democrats, many of whom had previously seen Roumie as a symbolic or token figure, now began consulting him on strategy and messaging. He was no longer just a guest advocate, he was a force. Even Republican members who once interrupted him or dismissed him with smirks stayed silent during later hearings. They had learned the hard way from Gaetz's collapse that Jonathan Roumie was not to be underestimated. Meanwhile, Matt Gaetz's response was a textbook example of what not to do in a political crisis. Instead of offering humility or a corrective statement, he doubled down, publicly and reckless. Just hours after the hearing, he posted a statement to his official congressional Twitter account. "Today's partisan ambush by Mr. Roumie was a desperate attempt by the left to distract from the real issues facing American families. My record speaks for itself. I won't apologize for standing up for economic freedom and fiscal sanity." The problem? Jonathan Roumie hadn't distorted anything. Every point he had raised, missed votes, speaking fees, stock ownership, was public record. Congressional documents, mandatory financial disclosures, and archived media transcripts backed up every word. Fact-checkers across the political spectrum validated Roumie's claims as accurate and fully verifiable. In contrast, Gaetz's denials rang hollow. Then came Gaetz's second misstep, a rushed Fox News interview the following night. Clearly rattled, and he said, "Look, I'll give Roumie credit, he's a smart guy, but no one just walks in with that kind of detailed information. That was clearly a coordinated setup by Democratic operatives. He didn't prepare that alone." The implication was clear and deeply offensive. Pundits and political leaders alike condemned the statement for its condescending and discriminatory undertones, suggesting that a man of faith and public service like Roumie couldn't possibly have researched and organized facts without help. Many saw it as elitist, even bigoted, and it unleashed another wave of backlash. Some of Gaetz's own Republican colleagues began publicly distancing themselves, recognizing that the damage had gone far beyond a bad day. It had become a symbol of how arrogance blinds leadership. But the final blow came days later, when Politico obtained leaked emails from Gaetz's office. One message from his chief of staff, sent just days before the hearing, read, "He's just an actor. Hit him hard and early, he won't expect it. Could be good TV." Another read, "Target Roumie, make it viral, we need the clip." The emails destroyed whatever credibility Gaetz had left. His claims of being ambushed, exposed as false. His attacks, premeditated. His arrogance, unmasked. Political analysts across the spectrum agreed. The Roumie-Gaetz confrontation wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point. "This was the death of the old political playbook," said Dr. Sarah Chen, a political scientist at Georgetown. For years, seasoned politicians could dominate by being louder, flashier, or more aggressive. But Roumie showed that in the age of social media and real-time fact-checking, authenticity and preparation are more powerful than performance. The clash also revealed a deeper truth, that outsiders, faith leaders, civil servants, community advocates were no longer powerless in the halls of government. When they came prepared, With facts, purpose, and principle, they could shatter the status quo. Jonathan Roumie's background as a spiritual leader, as a servant to the marginalized, as someone who had never sought fame for its own sake, had become his greatest strength. He wasn't just someone who had survived a political ambush. He was someone who transformed it into a national reckoning. Behind closed doors, even conservative strategists were now admitting the obvious. You can't just go on the attack anymore without expecting your opponent to hit back twice as hard, one Republican consultant confessed anonymously. The old playbook doesn't work when the other side has done their homework. And nobody had done their homework like Jonathan Roumie. 6 months after the hearing, the confrontation was still echoing across Capitol Hill. Among staffers, the phrase "pulling a Roumie" entered the political lexicon, slang for absolute preparation paired with moral clarity. It joined the ranks of famous political takedowns, recounted in orientation briefings and training seminars for newly elected members of Congress. For Matt Gaetz, the damage was real and lasting. His media appearances declined sharply, his sway within the Republican caucus waned, and his fundraising for the 2024 cycle fell behind other Florida Republicans by a wide margin. More importantly, according to insiders, Gaetz finally learned one thing: do your homework, or risk being undone by someone who did. For Jonathan Roumie, that moment at the hearing became a launchpad. He was invited to speak at major party conventions. He appeared on Sunday political shows, delivering not partisan rants, but principled reflections. Some even whispered his name in conversations about higher office. But for Roumie, it wasn't about ambition. It was about integrity and using truth as a tool of accountability. More important than TV segments or trending hashtags was the legislative outcome. The banking regulation bill at the heart of the hearing was amended and passed, this time with stronger conflict of interest provisions, inspired in part by the public scrutiny Roumie had brought to members owning stock in the industries they were tasked with regulating. The Roumie-Gaetz confrontation became required viewing for new members of both parties, not because of its drama, but because of its lessons. 1. Preparation always beats arrogance. Gaetz's swagger was no match for Roumie's research. 2. Personal attacks invite personal exposure. By questioning Roumie's competence, Gaetz exposed his own weaknesses. 3. In the age of cameras and social media, every second counts. A routine hearing became a political milestone. 4. Underestimating someone based on background, appearance, or title is a fatal mistake. Roumie wasn't a politician, but he was something more dangerous: prepared. The moment reminded America that real leadership isn't loud, it's principled, it's prepared, and it doesn't flinch under pressure. Jonathan Roumie's victory wasn't just personal, it was a moment for everyone who believes competence matters more than confidence. That substance beats style, and that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding the truth. If you believe facts are still stronger than feelings, if you believe preparation is power, hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and tell us in the comments, was this the most devastating political moment you've ever seen? Because the next time someone tells you that politics is just about the loudest voice or the sharpest soundbite, remember the day Jonathan Roumie showed Matt Gaetz what real preparation looks like. And remember, the truth always wins, especially when it's backed by 340,000 worth of reasons someone hoped you'd never find out.